The legislative session is over, Illinois has a new budget, and a whole host of new laws, but it remains to be seen how much longer it will continue to have an NFL football team. From Capital News, Illinois, it's Thursday, June 4th, 2026, and we'll give you the highlights of how the session went down on this edition of Capital Cast. Hello and welcome to a Thursday edition of Capital Cast. We're coming to you a day earlier than normal this week so we can get you caught up on the major news that came out of the State House over the last few days. I'm Peter Hancock, and joining me today are my colleagues Ben Szalinski and our editor-in-chief Jerry Nowicki. It was around 10 o'clock Sunday morning when Senate Appropriations Chairman L.G. Sims briefed his committee on a $56 billion budget package that had been negotiated since the start of the session. It was sometime around 4:30 Monday morning before the sun came up when the Senate finally voted on it. Ben, what was going on over the course of that 18 hours or so period when we were waiting on a budget bill to be voted on? Why did it take so long?
Yeah, I think some of it was just the slow nature of the legislative process. It takes a long time to actually file these bills, and there was other components that were missing. You know, the spending plan was filed on Saturday night, but we hadn't seen the revenue plan, the capital plan, bonding. Those are other components of the overall budget package, and lawmakers like to have all that in order before they start voting on the whole thing. So I think that was a lot of the delay. But from a political perspective, there was still debate among members about what should be included in the budget. I know specifically on revenue, there was some disagreements over a lack of a data center tax credit moratorium in the budget, a lack of other progressive revenues that were not included in the budget. So they were still debating some of that stuff in caucus and lining up the votes to making sure it passed. But ultimately, I think a lot of those kind of discussions that were being had in the final days, they were a little bit more bluster than anything else. I think just lawmakers trying to make their voices heard to one another. Ultimately, the budget passed pretty easily in both chambers. So I think it was just a lot of the slow nature of the legislative process, which was kind of a hallmark of this entire spring session where, it took forever to get anything done, it seemed.
Well, it was certainly a long night. A long morning for all of us, which it always is on the final day of the session. One thing about the budget, a big part of it was the K through 12 education spending. Public schools ended up getting a little bit more than Governor Pritzker had proposed. Specifically, lawmakers restored the property tax relief grant program that was originally part of the evidence-based funding law. So a few high-tax districts, we don't know which ones yet, will see some property tax relief in the upcoming year. But a lot of the more progressive lawmakers had been pushing for more education spending. They were pushing for more spending overall, I think, as you were just mentioning, part of which is to offset the federal spending cuts that are being passed down from the Trump administration. That would have taken a lot more revenue. Tell us about the revenue package. You mentioned a little bit of it there. How much new revenue did they pass, and where is it going to come from?
Yeah, I think we're still trying to evaluate how much new revenue there actually is in this budget. It's believed to be around $800 million. I've seen about $550 million that we know of for sure is in the budget. Some other sources, numbers aren't quite readily available on those. But, the big thing in this budget really is going to come from two areas on net operating losses for businesses. The amount that businesses can deduct from those losses is being changed, and that's going to result in the state receiving about $300 million more dollars from revenue in that. And then the other one is the social media usage tax that lawmakers have decided to implement that Governor Pritzker proposed in his February address. This will tax those big social media companies for each user that they have here in the state of Illinois. So those are the two main drivers. But then there's also other little things such as, fees on crypto digital asset transactions. Fantasy sports licensing is a new thing that was created by this budget. Apparently, the fantasy sports operators asked to be licensed. They will have a 15% fee to pay on their license. So there's a number of kind of smaller little things that are designed to raise revenue throughout this budget. There's other things that were included, such as a digital ad tax, which the state is not going to be collecting revenue on that this year. It created a framework to allow the state to implement this tax later on, assuming it survives court challenges. I don't think the state is terribly confident that a digital ad tax will withstand scrutiny in courts. This is being litigated in other states. So, lawmakers made the smart decision not to include revenue from a source that is probably going to end up not counting anyway. But that also makes the social media tax a little bit more confusing as well, because that is expected to be litigated as well. The city of Chicago has the exact same tax. It's currently held up in court right now. It seemed like lawmakers and the leaders of the General Assembly, as well as the governor's office, were trying to appease maybe some of those progressive lawmakers who wanted to tax digital advertising, big social media companies, and included that in the budget more for those reasons rather than, as revenue drivers for the upcoming fiscal year.
Okay, yeah. So I did want to ask about that social media tax because I think there's a lot of concern about it. It's not necessarily a tax on you and me for having a Facebook or a Twitter account or Instagram or anything like that. It's a tax on those companies. Has this been tried before? Is it in place anywhere else? I mean, what's kind of the legal justification for this?
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that in the revenue bill, it does explicitly say that these social media companies cannot pass the cost of these taxes on to you and I as the users of the site. But this is actually a brand new tax that we're seeing in the United States. Illinois would be the very first state to have a tax on users for social media companies, taxing the companies based on how many users they have. Chicago's the only other place where this has actually been tried. So this is very much an Illinois thing, very much a progressive thing. I guess, lawmakers do think it's going to be legal and it's going to withstand scrutiny because they are factoring in the $200 million in revenue it's going to bring in. That would be kind of a sizable chunk of revenue not to receive if the court strikes it down. So I guess they are confident that this is going to go forward, but it is certainly a very revolutionary, very Illinois and Chicago idea that's been put forward here.
Well, obviously, one of the thorniest issues toward the end of the session was the so-called mega projects bill. You can translate that to Chicago Bears Stadium, although they tried to encompass more than just the Bears. Final day, everyone thought they had a deal, but it ended up falling apart. Jerry and Ben, I remember when I think your cell phones went off and there was a sudden press gaggle somewhere. You both went running down there to find out what was going on. What was the proposed deal and why did it fall apart? Jerry, start with you.
Yeah. I'll never forget when Bill Cunningham walked out of the Senate Democratic Caucus. I don't even remember if it was the 30th or the 31st anymore.
It kind of blurs together at this
whichever
point.
One it was.
Saturday night, the 30th.
Yeah. So he walks out and he says, we don't have the votes, just casually in Bill Cunningham's, laid back delivery says, we don't have the votes right now for that bill that we've been talking about for months or years. We're going to go ahead and do something this way that allows the city to compete with other municipalities. So, it would essentially allow the municipalities with over 70,000 people in Cook County, I believe it is 60 or 70,000, to compete for luring the Chicago Bears. Now, realistically, that's probably Arlington Heights, where they own the former racetrack site, or, Chicago, where they currently play their football games. So it would allow the local municipalities to create stadium authorities, publicly own the stadiums and allow the Bears to essentially benefit from a star bond district in the surrounding area, which, long and short of it, allows them to reap a profit from tax growth in the areas. To an extent. I mean, that's oversimplifying it. Star bonds, fairly complicated thing, but that's what it comes down to.
And Ben, what happened there? It all just sort of fell apart at the last minute. I think the bill it got through the Senate, but then died in the House.
Yeah, this original bill, it passed through the House weeks ago, back in early April or something like that. But the Senate didn't have the votes for it for a number of reasons. There wasn't the appetite. And we also learned that the Chicago Bears were actually talking behind lawmakers' backs to the city of Chicago, and that was giving a number of Chicago senators the idea that the city of Chicago was in play. So that helped to sink that version of the bill. And then, Senator Cunningham tried to come up with this proposal that Jerry was alluding to that basically would kind of do what other states have as far as stadium projects, where the state is going to ultimately own the stadium. The Bears would pay to build the stadium. That was the idea that was put forward. It would provide the property tax certainty that the Chicago Bears were looking for in Arlington Heights, and the whole reason we're even having this conversation. But it was too late, frankly. That bill was filed at 10 o'clock at night on Sunday night. Lawmakers were just trying to wrap up session at that point. There was no time to review it, and that's what happened in the House. It passed out of the Senate, but House Speaker Chris Welch told us that it was just simply too late. It came in the middle of the night, the dead of the morning, and nobody had seen it on the House side. People had barely seen it on the Senate side, but they still voted for it. But the House did not feel comfortable taking up that position of ramming through a piece of legislation. They didn't actually have any idea what was in it. We've seen since then that, Representative Mary Beth Canty, who represents Arlington Heights, she told the Daily Herald that she actually doesn't think she would have supported the Senate bill. So, it certainly seems like everything just came together too late, filing a bill, coming up with some last second Hail Mary to throw across, at the end of session. It doesn't work with every lawmaker. And, I think that's kind of where we ended up. If the Senate probably recognized a few days earlier in the week that they had a problem, could file a different bill, I think there might be a different story being written here today.
Well, and one of the other reasons why we're having this conversation is there's a competing offer on the table. The state of Indiana has an offer out there, and apparently the state of Illinois does not. So at the risk of using too many sports metaphors, did Illinois just forfeit the game? And does Indiana win by default?
Not yet. I think, there's a very real question out there as to whether Illinois lawmakers have just called the Bears bluff. Do the Bears actually want to skip the state line? Seems like no, otherwise they would have taken the offer. There was this Tribune story and other reporting that there's steel slag, a lot of remediation work that needs to be done on the Indiana site. And now you got the Hammond mayor going on the Chicago Sports Radio and saying that was a hit piece, that you could start building right now. Maybe you could, but the Bears aren't, right? So is it a bluff? I have no idea. We've been trying to sort through the stuff here for weeks on end. Ben, Brendan, more so than I, but we're at a point where something's going to happen and the Bears can do what they want. Seems like right now they're in a holding pattern and kind of waiting to see if Illinois can shake something loose.
I don't think we truly even know what the Bears want. Maybe the Bears don't even know what they want at this point. I mean, they have led us to believe that it was Hammond or Arlington Heights. Crane Chicago Business reported on Thursday that, well, it turns out they met with the city of Chicago 6 times in April. So, and the way Brandon Johnson has characterized that meeting is it was about stadium deals and the future of a new stadium on that site. Who knows if that's even accurate? But the Bears, I think overall in this process, especially if you talk to lawmakers involved, a lot of folks are really frustrated with how the Bears interacted with them. their lobbying pitch wasn't great in Springfield at all. Kevin Warren was never present, even though he was present, phone and Zoom calls or whatnot. He was never in Springfield. And, I think a lot of folks are willing to take the bet that the Bears are bluffing about Indiana, that Arlington Heights is their preferred option, or they're just going to take more time and more years to figure this out because, frankly, there is no rush. They have Soldier Field for another 6 years or so.
The budget, taxes, and the Chicago Bears obviously consumed most of the oxygen in the room during the final few days. But while we were all sitting around waiting for those to pass, there was a mountain of legislation that went through dealing with all kinds of other just policy issues. I want to turn to Jerry and ask, first question on my mind is, should I tip my waitress in cash or is it okay to put it on the debit card?
Yeah, right now, it's business as usual for credit and debit cards. It's a real question as to whether, even if this controversial law didn't take effect, would you be able to use your credit or debit card on tips? But
and we're talking about a law.
Short,
Illinois was like the first in the nation to pass this law that said credit card companies can't charge fees, swipe fees for tips and for sales tax and things like that.
And essentially what that one came down to was it was a battle between banks and retailers, or, at least the lobbying groups for those entities, credit unions, card companies, all that stuff. The long and short of it was if that was allowed to take effect in Illinois, you'd essentially be showing the world that you could do this anywhere. And now the banks are really scared of, 100 different municipalities governing swipe fees 100 different ways and, cutting into this lucrative revenue source for them. You could go pretty deep into the weeds about whether or not this is a feasible thing that is even possible. You have stark disagreement between the retailers and the banks as to how easy this is for them to implement. But what it comes down to is Illinois has pushed it off for another year, and a federal judge who, in just as recently as February, ruled that the law can stand, now changed her mind because a federal agency rewrote the rules that she had ruled upon. So it's a fascinating thing. It's pretty in the weeds in terms of court lingo and all that. But if I were to sum it up one way, it's that this law that the banks are saying will create chaos is pushed back for 1 year and very well could be in very deep legal trouble because of the federal government has rewritten its rules governing swipe fees.
Okay, well, another issue I think that touches on just the daily lives of a lot of people in America these days, Uber and Lyft drivers, they can unionize in Illinois, according to legislation that went through. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's Jenna Schweikert, our intern's been doing a great job covering that issue. Long fought, long negotiated. Essentially, Uber and Lyft kind of loosened or lessened their opposition to it. I don't know if they were neutral or not. I'm not 100% sure where they slipped on the very last bill that passed. But I'll credit those sponsors. I'll credit those advocates for getting it to a point where, it's now on the governor's desk.
Any other policy bills out there that caught your attention?
Ben, you want to go first?
New regulations on ticket purchases, basically trying to restrict, robots that go in and purchase up all those tickets and then are trying to resell them for higher prices and whatnot on third-party markets. There's legislation out there to deal with that. And I just think, that was a really specific consumer issue that lawmakers brought up this spring. I think it's something a lot of people complain about and see in their lives as they're trying to buy concerts, sports tickets, and whatnot. So I'm very interested to kind of just see what that bill ultimately does for consumers in the state.
I'll give you two here, Peter. One is you sort of look at it and say, wow, why did it take this long? But the restitution for people wrongfully incarcerated for various crimes under Illinois' current structure, it maxes out at $199,000 for someone who has served 14 years or more. So whether you serve 14 or whether you served more than that, 50, you're maxing out at that 199 if you've been exonerated. And the more you serve, essentially, the lesser the payout you get. Now it'll be a $50,000 per year payout for year wrongfully accused if the governor signs this, and $25,000 per each year wrongfully served on like probation or parole is the word I'm looking for. That type of deal. So, I mean, that's a major thing for people who have been wrongfully accused. And then I'll go to this bill that limits how social media companies can target their feeds to children. It passed unanimously, so it seemed like a fairly uncontroversial thing. But I know there is some pushback within like the major tech companies. Essentially, you can't. If someone's under 16 years old, you got to show them feeds from people that they follow or stuff like that. You can't have these algorithmic feeds that are designed to addict these people to social media. But one interesting thing about the Illinois version, now it's been done in other states, but Illinois' version makes the phone manufacturers have some level of thing at the operating system level that requires them to take the phone operator's age. So it's a bit of a different way to do it, making the operating system have the thing rather than, connecting it to the apps. It's a bit of an in the weeds thing, but I imagine we might see some type of follow-up legislation on that because it is a bit of a novel way Illinois is trying to do it.
Okay, well, there were hundreds of bills that went through the legislature this session. We obviously don't have time to deal with them all, but those are a few of the more interesting ones. In the meantime, that's all the time we have for this edition of Capital Cast. Capital Cast is a production of Capital News Illinois, a public affairs reporting project of the Illinois Press Foundation. My thanks to Jerry and Ben for being here this week. Until next time, on behalf of the entire Capital News Illinois team, this is Peter Hancock saying thank you for listening.